good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Barry Pavel. I'm Vice President at the Atlantic Council here and the Director of the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security. I'm really delighted to welcome you to what I'm sure will be a fantastic panel today to help us address the issues raised in a new report by Scowcroft Center Senior Fellow for Middle East Security, Bilal Saab. The report's entitled After Hub and Spoke, U.S. Hegemony in a New Gulf Security Order. And the central thrust, I think, is a very interesting and timely set of suggestions for a more cost-effective approach to multilateralism by the United States, working with its extra-regional allies and in-region partners. And certainly on the heels of Jeffrey Goldberg's interview with President Obama, in which he referred to the Gulf states as free riders and asked them to share the region with Iran, there's been a lot of discussion about this set of relationships, and in particular after the Riyadh summit a couple of weeks ago, where they discussed a lot of issues that we'll address today. Certainly, a lot of tensions loom large over that summit meeting. Beyond the summit, the administration will need to do some hard thinking about how best to maintain productive relations with its key Gulf partners in order to enshrine the successes like the Iran nuclear agreement and bolster cooperation in the campaign against ISIS, among other important priorities. Against this backdrop, this new report today explores the opportunities for and benefits of greater multilateral cooperation between the United States, its European partners, and the Gulf states to formulate a more sustainable regional security architecture. So we'll look at, and the discussion will address today's trends, but also look out quite a bit to ensure we have some sense of how those the circumstances might change, and then come back to thinking about our strategy and posture. So this type of discussion is quite characteristic of the work that's been ongoing at the Council. In particularly recently, the Hariri Center's Middle East Strategy Task Force, co-chaired by Madeleine Albright and Steve Hadley, is bringing together a broad array of regional stakeholders and international experts to develop a long-term U.S. strategy that will be collectively addressed to help address the region's most acute strategic issues by directly engaging citizens and also stakeholders in the region. I accompanied the co-chairs recently to 6 different countries to meet with heads of state and civil society leaders, and this is a very promising and significant effort. More to come on that. And also, I think many of you are aware of the several projects in the Scowcroft Center on Gulf security and U.S. strategy, and including our Gulf policy and Iran strategy working groups. And you'll see some of our Iran strategy work coming out in the next couple of months. And please do check out our website. There's a Beyond Riyadh page that tracks a lot of these issues, several blogs that are relevant to the issue today. So joining Bilal on today's panel will be Kathleen Hicks, my former colleague, who is currently the Senior Vice President and Henry Kissinger Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She's an expert both in regional defense policy, military posture, and a wide range of other issues, having served just recently as Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Next on the panel is Mara Karlin, who currently serves as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy. She has held a variety of roles at the Department of Defense, and in particular in this role, she does address a lot of these issues working with her regional policy counterparts. Mike O'Hanlon is a Senior Fellow in Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution, where he specializes in a wide range of issues as well, but these include U.S. defense strategy, the use of military force, and American national security policy. And certainly last but not least, Michael Singh will moderate the panel. Michael is the Lane Swig Senior Fellow and Managing Director at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He's held a variety of positions and also served as Senior Director for Middle East Affairs at the NSC and in various capacities at the State Department. They've all been invited here today to address the issues raised in the report, looking at a time frame of today and out to tomorrow. I think with that, I'll just mention the events on the record. We encourage everyone to follow the conversation on Twitter by tweeting at AC Scowcroft with the hashtag Beyond Riyadh. And now I'll turn the program over to Mike. Thanks very much.
So we have Bilal here. All right, well, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to see everyone here. I'd like to thank Barry for his remarks and the Atlantic Council for putting this together. We have a timely topic here. I think it's now something you hear more and more often, that the regional security architecture in the Middle East has really, it's collapsed in a sense. That regional security architecture, which Bilal and others call hub and spoke, has collapsed for a couple of reasons. One is, of course, the events in the region itself. The Arab Spring, the uprisings that have followed, the war in Syria, the convulsions in Iraq, Libya, and so forth. But another reason, I think, is that the United States itself has been in a period of, you could call it strategic transition, for a long time. This isn't a new phenomenon. I would argue it started really with 9/11. And the need to focus more on counterterrorism. Obviously, the war in Iraq was a big departure from what we were doing in the 1990s, and President Obama came in with his own views on what our posture should be in the Middle East. And what we've heard from him recently in the interview with Jeffrey Goldberg is that maybe we need to de-emphasize this region. But I don't think it's just about presidential policies and priorities. It's also about how the world has changed. The United States is increasingly energy self-sufficient. We have priorities elsewhere in the world that are rising, hence the pivot to Asia. And we also have our own desire to cut back on our budget here, which means a greater need to prioritize in our defense posture and so forth. At the same time, our allies' interests and their capabilities are shifting as well. So it's a time not only for all those reasons, but also because we have a presidential election, if you haven't noticed. It's a time when we're going to need a new strategy, and we're going to have to factor in all of these things. And so Bilal has put out this timely report after Hub and Spoke. I encourage you to pick up a copy and read it. I think you can get a signed copy for like $25. Is that right? And we've got a great panel of folks here to comment on the topic as well as on the report. So without further, I'm not going to offer my own ideas, even though I have them because I believe in unpredictability in foreign policy. These guys don't, I guess. So I'm going to turn it first to Bilal and take it away.
Thank you, Mike. Good morning, everybody. I just returned from Bahrain, so I'll start with Bahrain. It's been 48 hours, so my memory is still fresh. The insights that I have from my visit in many ways relate to the topic of conversation today. So I'm at the base. I visited the base, and I'm waiting to see Commander Donegan, who commands NAVSAND, the Combined Maritime Forces, and of course the Fifth Fleet. And as I'm waiting in the lobby, enter two French senior officers who are part of one of the combined forces, whether it's CT 150, 151, or 152, I'm not sure. And in many ways, for me, this was a reminder of how much we do together already with our allies, whether it's the British or the French. But my point today is that we could do much more, and we could do it in much more formal fashion. In many ways, Combined Maritime Forces is a voluntary participation. It does include 30 nations, 6 continents, but like I said, it is voluntary. So the bottom line today of my argument is that given the strategic context that Mike just described, with us having shifting global priorities, regional transformation caused by the uprisings, the rise of ISIS and its global terrorist reach, and of course the fiscal realities in Washington, I think it's much more intelligent for us to invest in closer collaboration and consultation with some old, long-standing French and British allies who, by the way, have made some very serious decisions to return to the region and to amplify their military and political presence. For us, this offers us a much more sustainable U.S. strategy to police one of the most important east-west highways in the world. And I would also pair it with, and we might have a disagreement on that, with a strategic dialogue with also our adversaries, because I think it's equally important, not just working with those you agree with. And that would include, of course, the Chinese and the Russians, who also have made decisions, whether by default or by design, to up their involvement in the Middle East. And of course, Syria is one stark reminder of what the Russians have been doing. The Chinese, given their dependence on Middle Eastern oil, it's only reasonable to assume that they would increase their involvement in that strategic part of the world. So in many ways, this is an old, straightforward concept. I'm just revisiting it today, given the realities of the strategic context that we live in the Gulf, but also in the broader Middle East. I'm not going to go over once again what Mike described. I base the argument, obviously, on this observation of what we're seeing today, and on educated or uneducated projection given the next 10 to 15 years. So I think Pax Americana in many ways is changing, and some would say it's over. It's about time that we update this strategy that we've relied on for so long, since 1971, which is hub and spoke. We, the hub, of course, and the spokes are the set of security bilateral partnerships that we have with the 6 countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council. We've been very frustrated recently with allies in Europe and also partners in the region free riding. I mean, this is a term that's now more, frankly, mainstream in the US debate. And the only antidote to that, quite frankly, is getting much more serious about burden sharing. So with that, the details of what kind of a multilateral security architecture are in the report. I'm happy to go over those in Q&A. I don't want to go over the 5 to 7 minute presentation. But what I have in mind, frankly, is a simplified version of a P3+1, the P3 being the United States, the French, and the UK, +1 being a Gulf party. The Gulf party, we don't decide who they are. Preferably would like it to be the GCC as a whole, as a multilateral institution. But if they don't, if this is not really something that is achievable, given the many challenges that have bedeviled the organization for so long, then it will be a leading Gulf state, most probably Saudi Arabia. But this is not something that we would decide. They would decide on their own, of course, in the spirit of partnership and consultation with them. So P3+1 is what I envision, to simplify it. The direct contributions of the French and the British, I would summarize as follows. We remain committed to the high-level contingencies and to the primary deterrence functions that we have so effectively performed since the 70s. However, we would definitely rely on the French and the British to help us out with the low-level, medium-level contingencies that would include counterinsurgency and stability operations. And of course, we would rely on them considerably on the issue of reform. Now, I understand that this might be extremely counterproductive and controversial given the colonial pasts of the French and the British in the region. But I have the firm conviction that they understand the societies of the region far better than we do. And it's about time that we include them in this conversation about reform, because we don't seem to be doing quite a good job at it anyway. So more details about this, what I call a quadrilateral security forum in the Gulf, but I'll just stop here for now.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Bilal. I'm going to turn to Kath. You know, one other factor that we have to consider here is not just what's happening in the Middle East or our posture in the Middle East, but also the broader global factors. And so I'm going to turn to Kath, who has some thoughts on that.
Yep. Thanks very much to Mike and Bilal for his great study. It does fundamentally, in the end, I'm going to get to this point, but I'll start there too, come down to how much you are working with others. We in CSIS tend to talk about this as federated defense, and we've done a series of reports. Bilal studies very much of the same mindset, that partnership becomes very important as the budgets squeeze. And requirements stay high. So, what I want to do is step back a little and give you a little more of an operational or gritty perspective on how we should be thinking about global posture, and then the other panelists can return you to the Middle East more fully. Supporting the United States, it comes as a surprise, I'm sure, to no one here, for military posture overseas has always been problematic. This has been quite highlighted of recent, particularly Mr. Trump has made some statements about the costs and benefits, costs outweighing the benefits in the way he's laid it out of our overseas presence. But historically, of course, members of Congress in particular have always preferred to have military bases and the associated families and infrastructure and thus jobs be located in the United States. And that, there's an inherent logic to that from a member of Congress's perspective. Oftentimes, it's not worth it to rock the boat on this issue for those who want to put forces overseas. And even you have cases where military departments themselves are complicit because they think they can protect their end strength better if they have it inside a congressional district, because that that member will be more supportive of keeping the end strength overall. So you put all those factors together, and sometimes it's quite hard to make the strategic case for forces overseas. There's also, you've had periods of time, such as under Secretary Rumsfeld, where there's sort of a more philosophical sense that operational flexibility for the force, and I'll talk more about what that means later, is advantaged by having it on U.S. territory, right? Because nobody can tell you you can't use the force. That was, for him, I think, a searing experience relating to the Iraq campaign. So you put all these pieces together, and you can get a sense of some dislike in a variety of ways and cases and forms for U.S. basing overseas. And then you add on to that, that was just the U.S. perspective. Now you add on to it the perspective of the region or the country or the neighbors who are seeing that presence. And here in the Middle East, we see most directly the net negative potential for U.S. presence at times overseas. Well, so let me just briefly talk about the cost, sort of the great cost paradox of force posture. I think it's important for this debate and again, for the general geopolitical sense of how we think going forward in the environment we're in about posture. You know, in tough resource times, in point of fact, if you have to use the force a lot, forward posture is one of your best friends because you're that much closer to where you're trying to operate, which reduces the amount of your cost in terms of rotating your force there. And you can actually reduce the amount of force structure you actually need in order to maintain the same level of presence, if you will. So think in aircraft carrier terms. Sometimes in the Pentagon we call this Navy math, which is to say for every one carrier, for instance, that you have based in the region you want to use it, you have just saved yourself 3 carriers, because if you based that in the United States, whether we're talking West Coast or East Coast to go out, you need 4 carriers to maintain that rotation, right? So that's a lot of money. Each carrier today is about $10 billion. For, you know, that's $30 billion in theory you could save right there if you forward base. So there actually is a strong economic argument, despite everything I've just laid out, that is more in the political and strategic thought process. There's a strong dollar argument in terms of keeping forces forward if you're going to use them. If you don't use the force much, or you use it in a very different region than you anticipated, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So it's always a delicate balance. So let's now talk about what that means in today's environment and in particular for the Gulf. So we have a geopolitical environment that at least I believe to be at odds with the resources that we are prepared to spend on it. We're not alone on that. The French and the UK are 2 countries that Bilal's study particularly highlights. They are both in the same boat. So the extra-regional, if you will, partners for the Middle East are all constrained in some way. The Chinese have yet to indicate a strong willingness to grow their capacity to help with stability, and there is a question as to how much the United States would really want the Chinese to grow in that capacity. The Russians have displayed some capacity, and that would be an example where that's, again, a question as to how much we would want other extra-regional partners to step up other than our own allies. So the question, of course, on the dollar side is, you know, it's not necessarily that $500 billion that the United States is spending on defense is not enough. I think that's a debatable issue, truly a debatable issue. But I think we could all agree who work in this space, and Mike is another who does, that there are many trends and political considerations that are limiting the utility of the money we have. So the world should not be that way, but as it is right now today, we are very limited in how we can strategically use the funds that are going toward defense, largely due to, again, overhead, military health care benefits, et cetera, that are at this point in time sort of fixed costs that we can't get around. So that does mean that having others spend into that burden and to spend wisely is important. Those 2 things don't always go together. We have some allies and partners who are spending, the Gulf states among them, but having them spend wisely into the common security interests is very important. So an example in the Gulf case might be, we know we need more counter-mine capability, we know we need more naval maritime patrol, but what interests most regional partners in tactical 5th generation or 4th generation tactical aircraft. That doesn't mean those things aren't important, but that becomes an issue of how do you not only get everyone to spend into the burden, but how do you start to actually federate or collaborate so that we understand where the UK, where the French, where Gulf partners where the Israelis are spending, and how those things can form together across threads of cooperation to create a greater whole. So, in terms of political implications for the Gulf, based on what I've said to you, just to summarize, Americans have historically not wanted to be in the Middle East in large numbers, and given the politics of the region and the history of colonial powers in the region, there are some good reasons why that net negative effect, as I mentioned before, is always a caution on US policymakers about how exactly to be present in the Gulf. And the same will be true for the Brits and the French. It's a little different in each case based on historical experiences and relationships in particular parts of the region, but that's another piece that has to be coordinated. And yet the Middle East is in the middle. I hate to say something so simplistic and somewhat silly sounding, but it's important to remember that when we look at posture for regions, we're not just looking at how it's used in that region. It's also about how those forces in that region can be used elsewhere. Sometimes we talk about this as a lily pad effect. So back to my point about the Navy math, if you are thinking about posture in the Gulf, you are also thinking about its implications for, and vice versa, Africa, the Indian Ocean, Europe, the Mediterranean. So those are all considerations that have to go in it's very hard to look just regionally at your posture. You want to look at how your global posture can support a range of operations. So let me close by saying, when I was in the Pentagon, and I assume this is generally still the case, but the way you think about global posture, and I would suggest to you that you think about posture even inside the Middle East alone, is really guided by 4 sets of premises for the United States, selfishly really for the United States, but probably true of any power, extra-regional power. First, what is your strategic purpose? What is the overall signaling and messaging as it relates to your national security interests and strategy that you're trying to convey? And this can come across, again, in terms of, do we want to be present in a highly military way? What is the weight of deterrence versus assurance versus a keen sense of over the horizon because of the politics of the region? The second is the political considerations, which are tied, of course, to strategic, but are much more about what makes sense for any given, say, host nation in terms of what works for its politics and its politics with its neighbors with regard to how the US presence might be treated. A third is, of course, the operational, the straight-up military perspective of how well can I deploy the force, how well situated is that location for how I want to use it, how does it fit into a global footprint of the forces and capabilities that I have, and then finally the feasibility, which is largely about cost, environmental considerations, and whatnot come in there. So when you think about US posture in this region or elsewhere, I would simply say I think the geopolitical context is partnerships are absolutely vital. Whether you call it federated defense or you call it hub and spoke approaches, working with others, or past hub and spoke, working with others is vital, and it's incredibly difficult because each country comes with its own national interest. And as Bilal indicated in his recommendation with regard to the Gulf states, it's not for us to dictate to them how they come to the table. It's a conversation about what capabilities each should bring that meet their own national interests, yes, but also can contribute to that collective security.
Great. Well, thank you, Kath. I'm going to skip over Mike for a moment and go to Mara next. Go ahead.
Great. Well, thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here and to discuss Bilal's really thought-provoking piece. We are at an interesting moment in the Gulf. I think Mike did a perfect job of delineating some of the just many variables that exist. And I just want to underscore that. This is a moment of profound change, and we're all still diagnosing what's happening. And just as we think kind of what is next and what does it look like, there's a lot of utility to spend time on this diagnosis. Not just only amongst ourselves, but also with our partners and allies. So I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking a little bit about the role of other parties. How do we kind of conceptualize that? What are the prospects for change? And I really think of these in 3 groups. I think of these as the regional partners, our European allies, and then what I would term from the US point of view, our competitors, Russia and China. There are a couple key points to be aware of. First of all, how do we all see the threats? And Kat started to mention this as we think about posture, and it is really critical. At the end of the day, especially if you're looking at a strategic relationships of sorts, are we actually seeing the threat similarly, and where are we disagreeing? Secondly, as any good strategist will do, we really have to obsess over opportunity costs. When I talk about the Europeans, this is particularly relevant because there actually are some significant ones if we look globally beyond our soda straw of the Middle East. And thirdly, this term burden sharing, I'd like to encourage us to move beyond a bit. I'm just not sure that it really captures what we're trying to think of, and I do think it has a bit of a negative connotation, unfortunately. I think of it more in terms of additive, complementary, and substitutive. How do we use that paradigm as a way to approach how we're working with others? And working with others is not a new thing. It's something we always do. It is something, the United States has never gone to war on its own. We even won a Revolutionary War long ago with the help of the French. And so it's just a point worth highlighting as we try to think about future challenges. So when we look at regional partners, effectively, I think you'd say we see the threats pretty similarly on the whole in terms of concerns about ISIL, in terms of concerns about the Iran trifecta, Iran's nuclear capabilities, conventional capabilities, and then destabilizing misbehavior or work with kind of non-state violent actors. It is easy to romanticize hub and spoke, especially since we're trying to think beyond it. I have a great memory of Secretary Gates writing it out, scribbling it out on a note card as we were starting the Gulf Security Dialogue now 9 or so years ago. And it's worth questioning, did the parts really end up being more than the whole? And how much have we been able to shift these relationships from just thinking about stuff and what we're giving folks to emphasizing training, emphasizing exercises. I think that has been a really big push, particularly of the most recent visits by Secretary Carter and the President. There's something to be said for the bilateral piece, because as much as we may take the Gulf as one entity, all of us know it's actually incredibly diverse. And so the Emiratis would be one case study that I think is really worth looking at. We've started a pretty robust dialogue with them over the last 2 years as they try to think about what's their future defense strategy, how do they conceptualize threats, and how should they be using their force. If you look at some of the steps they've taken, they don't just have capabilities, they have a willingness to act. They moved their Ministry of Defense to Abu Dhabi. They're thinking about what that means in terms of civilian roles. So I think they're asking a lot of the right questions, but this is obviously an evolutionary effort. So as you think of that paradigm, I think we can see a lot of our Gulf partners really playing, at a minimum, an additive role, but really a complementary one. As we turn to the European allies, and by this I really mean the British and the French, we do see threats similarly, but we also can't dismiss the significance of migration and what that's doing to them right now. Mm-hmm. That's actually zeroing in a lot of effort for those countries. The sort of counter-terrorist threat writ large is ringing very loudly in their minds. The French right now actually have more of their force deployed inside French territory than outside, which is pretty interesting and has some intriguing implications. Then, of course, there's this issue of their backyard. So it is important, no doubt, for the Europeans to think about the Middle East. Given what we see with the revanchist Russia, that's also a very high priority. And I think both of those countries are trying to figure out what does that mean, how do they balance it? And from the US point of view, that's also important. When the Brits released their latest defense strategy, and I think Michael Fallon actually came to the Atlantic Council to discuss it, you saw this effort where they're really trying to do both of these things and to do so thoughtfully. I think this is a great example of where we're already seeing a lot of collaboration with the United States and both of these countries. We've deepened our strategic planning dialogues pretty profoundly, particularly as they relate to force management and force development. What that means is how we are using our militaries in the day-to-day operations and then how we are building our future militaries. This is not just ephemeral, it has real-world implications. So for example, if you were following the carrier gap that happened a few months ago, if you saw what our European allies were doing at the same time, you actually, I think, see some of the fruits of this labor. So thinking about how are we using our forces today, how are we doing security cooperation with other partners around the world, and how are we developing our future force? So overall, I see a really complementary role here. And then finally, there are the competitors. And I think this is probably where Bilal and I differ a bit, especially vis-a-vis the Russians. So I don't think that they actually see the threat similar to how the United States does, nor to how the Gulf states do. And of course, the perfect case study here is Syria. I think it is pretty clear that Moscow was sitting supporting Assad, supporting Iran, supporting Hezbollah, and I don't think that that falls in line with where the Gulf states have been. And so that is meaningful. I think we see largely transactional interest in the region. No doubt, given China's dependence on oil, that is going to probably deepen, but I still don't see it actually becoming substantive. Bilal has a great line in his paper where he's talking about Russian weapons being easier, faster, and cheaper. That will always be the case. Any of us who have tried to reform how the United States does security assistance knows we're just never going to be the fastest. Beyond potential,
Never say never.
I don't want to say never. I really want to believe, and we'll keep fighting that fight. It's just, we have different ways of thinking about these things, right? We care about a number of issues like human rights violations that countries like China and Russia don't. We care about sustainability. We care about the fact that we don't want to hand manuals that are in the wrong language to countries that are actually going to have to use the material. We care about them having training. I don't think we see that with the Russians and Chinese. So at the end of the day, I don't know how useful this will really be. Moreover, it's really important to take kind of that long-term strategic perspective. When you look at how the US is dealing with Russia right now, and when you look at how we're dealing with China, there are much, much bigger issues than their involvement in the Middle East, to be frank. When we see what the Russians are doing in the European theater or what the Chinese are doing in the East China Sea and South China Sea, I think those are going to invariably be more significant than having some sort of, what I would see, probably tactical level dialogues on the region. So really just to wrap up, we're all trying to think about the what's next, and that's really important and that's meaningful. It would be really useful, though, to try to focus on the where we are. And moreover, we have a lot of examples over the last 15 years where the Gulf states, where the United States has really worked together in ways that have been successful, ways that probably haven't been. It's worth kind of stepping back and studying those and thinking through, so where have we all been successful in thinking about deterrence? Where have we succeeded in thinking about reassurance? That's going to help as we shape what the next looks like. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Mara. Mike.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be part of this great group today. And I just wanted to speak a little bit about Russia and China, as Bilal had asked me to, and to sort of round out many of the other topics that have already been addressed. And I agree with much of what I've just heard, but I guess not being in government, I can be maybe a little less risk averse in thinking about the roles of Russia and China looking down the road, although I thought your analysis was very balanced, Mara. But I think that for me, I'm a little more hopeful that our interactions with Russia and China in the Gulf region can be at least not negative. Whether they are substitutive or not is a separate question, and to use your terminology. But let me give a couple of examples. First of all, I'm just going to talk about Russia and Syria and China and basically maritime operations vis-a-vis Iran. And on these two sets of issues, there are obviously a lot of things we have to worry about, right? So let me just be upfront that I'm not here to be an appeaser or to be naive about competition. Russia's role in Syria has been cynical and very counterproductive for any hope about the moderate opposition, such as it is, developing further. And I think motivated almost exclusively by traditional realpolitik considerations. Nothing noble about it. But I'm going to come back to be slightly more positive in a second, but let me put those ideas on the table first. And in terms of how we might collaborate with China in the broader Gulf, I'm not so negative about what their role has been so far, but I think we would have to be extraordinarily careful at any kind of military collaboration that envisioned data sharing or any other kind of way in which China could learn more about how we operate in the high technology sphere of operations, because obviously we have to worry about the Western Pacific and other places we might interact with China in a less friendly fashion, which means we have to be very concerned about security, about secrets, classification, and so forth. So those are the constraints as I see them, broadly speaking. But now let me come back to Russia and Syria just for a moment. And first I want to do a quick little critique of American policy of the last 5 years, and then use that to sort of create a little bit of a semi-hopeful vision for where we might collaborate in the future on Syria policy with Russia. And then mention just a couple of specifics on what we might do with China in the Gulf. Okay, so having said what I just did about Putin's motivations, I would also say that if I were a Russian, I could make at least as devastating a critique of American policy towards Syria in the last 5 years. We claimed that we were interested in an Arab Spring. We encouraged it on. And then the moment that it really got going in Syria, we decided our #1 goal was not to engage in any significant way that required any American help whatsoever that was going to potentially draw us in. So I'm a general defender of Obama administration foreign policy, but I would consider Syria to be our #1 failed area of operation in the last 5 years. Because the president has understandably wanted to avoid big American commitments. He has therefore continually overpromised what he would do for the moderate opposition. This has led to a lot of dissension with our GCC partners about how to help an opposition that would try to unseat Assad. We've maintained the twin goals of both having Assad be displaced from power and now having ISIS be destroyed, which are potentially contradictory unless you're prepared to put a lot more effort in than we have. And we've almost maintained this with a straight face, that we are actually interested in defeating ISIS and replacing Assad simultaneously, which has produced a negotiation strategy, which to me is the single most oxymoronic thing we have in American foreign policy today, where we claim that we can actually persuade Assad and his friends for him to step down from power in a process that clearly is not going to have that result. Anyway, I'm, in a way, caricaturing what I would say if I were a Russian, but about 3/4 of what I just said, I actually think holds water if you were taking that kind of a critique, which means that even though the Russians have been very cynical, they have sensed an opportunity, knowing that our #1 goal in Syria was simply not to engage, and everything else followed from that. So where does that leave us? And now to try to be a little bit more hopeful, because I do think our motives have been better than Russia's. It's just we've been so inept at how we've pursued our policies in Syria that we've wound up being less helpful to our own friends, and we've wound up with a situation in which the strongest parties are essentially all our adversaries. Assad's army, ISIS, al-Nusra, Hezbollah. And the only other group that's of comparable strength in Syria is the Kurds. So 1 out of 5 is sort of a group we can work with. The other 4 are all our nemeses, and that's what's happened as a result of American policy of the last 5 years. So we didn't have the luxury of having a perfect outcome, and we got to be a little careful about how we critique Russia. Having said that, what does that suggest to me? It suggests that we actually have to think about basing policy with realities on the ground in mind. And that's going to mean some kind, we have to do, militarily speaking, more support for whatever moderate opposition we can find or redefine or wean away from al-Nusra without being too pure. And secondly, we're going to have lower standards for what our ultimate success would be. Assad's not going to go, I don't think. Certainly not in any foreseeable time frame. The Russians might say that they're willing to help create a new government. They are saying that out of one side of their mouth. Out of the other side of their mouth, they're enjoying the fact that they've shored up a proxy's position and embarrassed us. And I do not share President Obama's take on Vladimir Putin, that he's basically a polite guy who's presiding over a decaying country and just trying to hold on to what he's got. I think Putin is enjoying sticking it in our eye and will continue to do that. Now, it doesn't mean that he's fundamentally interested in necessarily hurting our goals in each and every instance, but he is not going to do something as a favor to us. He's not going to try to displace Assad as a favor to us. So realistically speaking, our political strategy, I think, needs to envision confederation of some kind of power-sharing arrangement in which Assad is still ruling over the western part of the country, but we can create or see created alternative autonomous zones in other parts of the country that are ruled by others. And then you could perhaps have a weak federal government as a chapeau over all of that, in which Assad is not a member. And that would be the way in which you would square the different interests of the different groups. So having put forth this somewhat harsh critique of both Russia and the United States in terms of how we've handled Syria so far, I do think there is a potential way forward, and it is to basically recognize the Russians are not going to push Assad out for us. They are not going to try to recreate some happy, multi-ethnic, multi-confessional state just to serve Western ideals of what Syria should be. But their own interests in holding on to Tartus, in holding on to some Alawite role in the West, in showing that they're a dependable supporter of their clients, these goals are potentially consistent with confederation. And that should be the end game towards which we try to work. So, Bilal, that's sort of my effort to try to take on your challenge. And in regard to China, I'll be much more brief, which is simply to say, we already are doing counter-piracy cooperation with them in the Gulf of Aden. That's been very good. One of the reasons it's good is because we can all give each other our own geographic sector. We don't need to link our data systems. We don't need to let the Chinese into our cyber networks any more than they already are by their own doings and devices. And this is sort of a simple, low technology kind of concern. And you can imagine incremental steps up from that that would include things like mine warfare. Now, mine warfare can get pretty technologically advanced as we start using more underwater robotics and things and systems like that to do our own work. And we don't necessarily want the Chinese to learn about how we do all of that. But to the extent that there are geographic zones and different time periods that can be essentially shared in the context of a future crisis or any other kind of situation in which China and the United States both have an interest in preserving the flow of oil, and that becomes a shared concern in the context of a conflict, I think we could imagine various kinds of incremental next steps. And I think people like Mara and others are already probably thinking about this, perhaps sometimes talking with the Chinese about where the counter-piracy mission could go next. And again, as I say, there are geographic and technological modest
as maybe interests with our allies in the Gulf. And I want to ask, and maybe I'll specifically ask you, Bilal, but anyone who wants to chime in on this, please do. Is that right? When you look at the conversation now, there are differences that seem to emerge. You hear a lot of criticism right now of Saudi Arabia in the United States for the perception that they have fueled the extremist problem in the region, which we're grappling with. You hear criticism coming the other direction, that we're not serious about countering Iran, which the Gulf states see as their #1 threat. And then on the interest side, obviously, the Gulf states have a very keen interest in getting oil out of the Gulf, and we're growing increasingly energy dependent. You compare this to sort of when NATO was created, when other sort of regional security architectures were built, where there was a clear common threat that we had in mind. So what do you think? Do we have that situation today where we have those threats and interests bringing us together, or are they driving us apart?
Okay, that's a tough question, but it's certainly out there. The fact that the threat perceptions have been quite different with regard to the immediate challenge being ISIS as far as we're concerned. And of course, to them, it is Iran first and foremost. I don't have a hopeful projection, frankly, in how we're going to completely agree on that in the future. Just geography, as Mara mentioned before, plays a huge role. It's in their own immediate environment, the history of Iranian bad behavior in the region. All of that affects them in ways that don't affect us. But it gets back to what I was saying before regarding bringing in the French and the British, not just to contribute in terms of military operations and capabilities, but also trying to think more broadly about this issue of asymmetric warfare regarding Iran, and then also on the issue of counter-extremism with ISIS. If we approach it, I think the common denominator here obviously is the issue of reform, right? I mean, this issue, if it's treated effectively, if it is treated with seriousness in ways that it hasn't been thus far, there's in many ways we can address both issues, whether it's Iran or ISIS, that would be mutually beneficial, not just for us, but for them too. So bringing in the French and the British and including them in this conversation about reform, I think is very important because, as I mentioned before, we haven't done a very good job pushing this process forward in ways that doesn't alienate our partners. So I don't have a really good answer for how we can once again, totally find common ground on the issue of threat perceptions. It's just that, they're in a different geography, and we're in a very different place as well. But I am hopeful with the help of our allies who are increasingly interested in the region, and their stakes in the region are becoming much more important.
Any other thoughts?
I just add, not to be overly simplistic about it, but it's inevitable. Again, every country is going to have its own national interests. They are never, even the British and the U.S., right, going to fully align, let alone the U.S. and each individual Gulf state. So you look for those areas where there is a common threat viewpoint, there is a common interest, and you build from there. And I think the challenge has been to move away from, for instance, burden sharing, which I completely agree with Mara on, to a more positive vision of what is it we're talking about without calling it, collective security or global order in this amorphous way. You have to build these individual threads of cooperation, but at the same time, you have to be thinking about the architecture you're moving toward, right? And that's very complicated, but that is the reality, which is you have to have the vision of where you're trying to go in the national interest sense for the United States, in this case with regard to the Gulf. And then you're looking for those opportunities where your interests align with those of the partners, and how can we build those threads that then themselves hopefully build trust to build up further toward that architecture. It's not an easy thing to lay out in one step.
Got it. So the second question is more operational, more technical. And Kath, I wanted to start with you on this question, given your remarks. And that's about our posture itself in the Gulf. We right now have the Fifth Fleet in the Gulf. We have aircraft carriers there. Aircraft carriers are big targets. We have bases in the Gulf. Bases are big targets. We see the Iranians across the Gulf developing missile capabilities, unconventional warfare capabilities, and so forth. If you compare this region to the Pacific region, because of China's A2AD capabilities, we're moving away from this idea of big bases close into a potential adversary and so forth. So if Iran moves in that direction of further developing its A2AD capacity, which seems to me likely, rather than building a sort of big army and big navy and so forth, what does that mean for our posture? Do we have the wrong posture in the Gulf? Do we just need to change it?
Well, I'm going to sidestep the very last part of that, because I think your posture, you're always, again, I'm this is my world, you're always trying to perfect it. So whether we have the right or the wrong, inevitably we don't have exactly the right posture. But again, you can't just say this is the spot I want to, these are the spots I want to be on the map, and therefore I am there. They tend to exist inside sovereign territory that we don't own. So it's you have to weigh all these other factors into it. But let me get back to the real question on A2AD. The first and most important thing I would want to say on that is we shouldn't just always think about counter A2AD. We don't stand still. Well, we shouldn't, right? While adversaries develop ways to approach us asymmetrically. We should assume adversaries, if they're smart, they should be thinking about ways to come at us asymmetrically. And guess what? So should we. So the United States has to be thinking in terms of its own military development, and then applied to each regional situation and the context of each potential adversary. What are the ways in which they're going to come at us, and how do we come at them and their weak points? So part of the answer is a strong defense, or a strong sort of frontal assault, I think, as Ash Carter likes to talk about it, in terms of if they mine, how well do we countermine? If they have missiles, how well can we defend against missiles? But you do have to go beyond that, right? And this gets to the issues of dispersal under fire. So do you have large bases? Well, there's some advantages. There's some cost advantages. There's logistics advantages. There's training advantages to large bases, and even large bases inside the threat envelope, so to speak. And by the way, that threat envelope is extending. So simply trying to say we should push US forces in any given region further and further and further out is a losing proposition, because the missile capability is getting so much better than the defensive missile capability, if you will, and the cost really is the issue, the cost differential between the offense and the defense, that's not a winning proposition. So you do have to be thinking about, where does it make sense to have those main operating bases? How do you make them resilient? And that can mean anything, again, from dispersal under fire, dispersal under warning, where you say, I think something's about to happen, or holy cow, something's happening, and you move assets, your ability to quickly move assets, your ability to harden those bases, defend those bases, those things all come into play. Naval capability has always been advantageous in the Gulf for this reason, which is to say, you're not sitting on a territory. You really are down to missiles and airplanes, and at a certain distance. where small ships are not a very likely threat if you're far enough out. So those become very important. I think a carrier-based approach makes more sense in the Gulf than it does in the Pacific because the Iranians are not as advanced as the Chinese. That does not mean that that will always be the case, that just as subsurface warfare is so vital in the Western Pacific, we may come to a point where where the threat evolves enough on the Iranian side that we have to start thinking about a subsurface strategy. It's really one of our big asymmetric advantages there. So anyway, I could go on, trust me, but I'll stop there and simply say I don't think it's just about, you do have to counter it, but it's also about thinking about what are the weak points for the Iranians and how do you invest there. And I'll leave it at that.
Mara or Mike, you guys have thoughts on this?
Sure. First of all, it's a really thoughtful question. I think oftentimes when people talk Middle East posture, it's just a matter of more and how much more can we get and what more can we throw there. And that doesn't make a ton of sense. And I couldn't agree more with everything Kath really outlined there. You really want to think about this in terms of the capabilities and the threats and what we have there. And we've got some pretty robust capabilities there. As we look at the Asia Pacific, we've kind of obsessed over this issue of thinking about posture differently, about dispersal and resiliency and passive defenses. A lot of that thinking now we are increasingly starting to apply to the Middle East. Iran is not nearly as capable as China, but it's not inconceivable that you could see it really going along that path. What worries me probably the most about our Middle East posture is actually how we pay for it. Last I checked, about 90% of our posture is actually paid for in supplementary funds, what's known as overseas contingency operating funds. So if you've been out there, and I know most of us have spent a lot of time out at the different bases there, et cetera, the overwhelming majority of that we're paying for through sort of bonus money, if you would think about that that way. And that's not a terrific thing, probably, given that this is a really important presence and one that we'll want to continue in a smart and thoughtful way.
There are some presidential candidates who have raised the question of how we should pay for our bases overseas, just FYI. This is a joke, I'm sorry.
I got it.
Let me pick you up on that joke, though, because it's interesting. The Middle East is so different from other parts of the world in this regard at multiple levels, and you've hinted at a couple of them already. But let's just start with the sort of various points that Mr. Trump tends to make about overseas partners. He talks about they're not spending their fair share on their militaries. I think that's true. That's one of the things Trump says that's true in regard to NATO in particular. It's not true in regard to the Middle East. In the Middle East, I was just checking some of these numbers the other day. Israel is spending more than 6% of its GDP on its military. We spend 3%. Saudis, almost 13%. The Iraqis, almost 13%. Of course, 1 or 2% of that is from our aid, but nonetheless. There are a lot of countries that are living in a dangerous neighborhood, so they're spending a lot. So that's point one. Point two, though, however, as Mara just said, is that we don't have a well-worked-out way of maintaining these forces. And by the way, they're really expensive in the Middle East because a lot of the basing arrangements, even the ones that have been around for a while, are sort of done in a expeditionary fashion. And so they wind up being a lot more expensive than the bases in Japan, Korea, Australia, Germany, Italy, the UK, what I think of as the big six of our traditional partnerships in those regions. And so there are a lot of costs. And it's not realistic to blame the allies for not doing enough. But on the other hand, our presence is incredibly expensive. Both those points are flipped from the realities in Asia and Europe. So it's just worth sort of situating ourselves in that kind of a factual backdrop. But I think that as a rule, I would just want to agree with Kath and Mara as well. But I do think that we have some opportunities if we can do dispersal and hardening and so forth, we have some opportunities to perhaps put a little more land-based tactical air power in the Gulf, because we have more countries that do share our threat perception at this point. In contrast to 15, 20 years ago, when a lot of our desire was to scale this stuff back, I would be interested in looking at modest ways to add a squadron here and a squadron there on land, because it is less expensive if you can do it. Now, you have to worry about missile threats. You have to worry about host nations getting in your way on specific operations. But the economics of it are appealing if you can avoid those needing 4 or 5 or 6 carriers to maintain one on station.
Great.
I just wanted to add
Sure.
one, you say Trump and we could probably go all day, but I will add, I promise only one more thing on this point, which is we just have to remember that, and Middle East is a great example of this, it's not like it's always the case that we are there because they're begging us to be there. Now, there are cases now in the Middle East where they are, in fact, very much wanting us to be there. But we also essentially are pushing ourselves in many cases because it's in our interest to be there. And so that's where the cost piece becomes, I think, confusing for people, because if it's portrayed as defense of that, country, as opposed to this creates strategic, political, operational, flexibility for the United States that we are invested in. Those are very different paradigms to be operating in, and we tend in the United States to fixate politically, and again, for years, well before Mr. Trump, and not only Mr. Trump today, we tend to fixate on the former and not the latter. We set that system up for ourselves. So it's a pretty good deal.
I think that's an excellent point. So with that, why don't I open it up for questions from the audience? We do have some people here I know who are from some of these partner countries and so forth, and of course we welcome your comments on all this. So yes, Simone.
Simone, I'm a visiting fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
Maybe just one second, Simone. Here's a
Coming.
mic. Yep.
Hi. I wanted to ask you a question about the P3, because you tend to... Oh, sorry.
Third time's a charm.
A question about the P3. You talk a lot about capabilities and posture, and I think it's indeed in the US interest to have France and the UK to have political and military postures that are enhanced in the Middle East. But you don't talk a lot about the strategic vision of those allies and the extent to which the US is able to embed the vision of France and the UK about the region. Yep. It happens that in the past 15 years, the two most consequential decisions by the United States in the region, the 2003 Iraq War and the US strategy with regard to Syria, has been made in a context where the P3 disagreed strongly with harsh consequences. How is the US able to integrate the strategic vision of its allies and not only rely on their capabilities to advance its national interests? Thank you.
Very good. Thoughts?
Just very quickly, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, this is quite a critical component of what I was just talking about, and maybe I should have mentioned it much more explicitly. We often talk about interoperability, which is typically the way we've used it in very narrow fashion. But the real political strategic interoperability is where we start talking about common approaches and common visions and common strategies. We actually haven't done a good job at that for probably 2 or 3 reasons that I can think of. One, we've always thought that we could do it alone better than the others. And there are benefits to autonomy, which, as you know, it gives us utmost flexibility in how we think and how we strategize and how we operationalize, right? We don't have to consult with our allies. And by the way, they happen to be deploying inferior military capabilities. That's one aspect to it. Second, I think for this to work, once again, couldn't agree with you more, it has to happen on a strategic level. But that doesn't mean it's going to be very easy. But it has to start, which is why this report is for the next 10 to 15 years, right? For the tactical operational stuff to work, there has to be at least a common denominator on the strategic on the strategic level, and that has to happen here. The decision has to be made here from the White House, all the way communicated to our commanders in the Gulf and other parts of the Middle East. So 100% agree with you on that.
Any other thoughts?
I think you're raising some really important points. I mean, but no matter how close we are, we're never going to agree on anything. And 2003 is a little tough, perhaps, to use as the case study, just because there has been just so much robust debate, I think, both inside the United States and kind of globally as to the extent to which that maybe made sense or did not make as much sense. So it's making sure that we're having really frank dialogues, which we are able to do. But there's another piece, which is making sure that our allies actually have capabilities, because there's actually no utility in just talking about their willingness if they don't have the capabilities. And the Brits have been a really good case study here. There was a period of time over the last few years where the British military became so weak that we couldn't expect things of them that I think we all would have wanted to do so. They have shifted that trajectory quite substantially, and they are on, I think, a positive one. I think when we look at how the French are thinking about defense budgets, they are also on that positive trajectory. But we're always going to disagree on how exactly we should be doing things and what we should be doing. We need to make sure one another is capable of doing so, and then thinking through our willingness and what makes sense.
I'll add one thought, which is on a specific scenario that I think we're going to have to worry about in the future, not in the near term, but over a longer term period of time, if and when there is a Syria peace deal. And again, I don't expect this to come out of Geneva, and I don't see it in the next year or two. But if and when there is one, it's, in my opinion, not going to be self-enforcing. This is going to be, from all the literature of what we've seen in the history of civil wars that are extremely bloody among multiple parties over a long period of time have a high risk of recurrence and do not typically self-enforce unless somebody just wins outright. And therefore, there's going to have to be some kind of an international peace implementation or peacekeeping operation in all likelihood. And the United States, under any conceivable president that I could imagine, is not going to be signing up to provide 50% of the forces to that mission in this case. And so therefore, it's going to have to be very multilateral. And we know that our British and French friends are fairly good at this sort of thing, and they're also perhaps better at thinking about how to do military operations economically. So if we try to apply the Petraeus-Mattis requirements for counterinsurgency and stabilization to a Syria peacekeeping mission, all of a sudden we just generated a requirement for 400,000 international troops to implement this deal, which obviously is a non-starter. So we're going to have to think in terms more of traditional UN peacekeeping missions with robust rules of engagement backed up by an American CT force, perhaps, that sort of thing. But European collaboration is going to be crucial in this kind of a mission. And again, I don't think it's anywhere near imminent. But as we all can remember from the Bosnia negotiations 20 years ago, once these things come to the cusp of being achievable, you have to have a very fast discussion about the peacekeeping force, because you don't have a big window between when you sign the deal and when that force has to start arriving. So it's good to get that kind of a scenario on the table right now.
Well,
yeah, just very quickly, I probably had 17 caveats in the report regarding, increased collaboration with the French and the British, and of course, equally on the issue of, engaging in a strategic dialogue with the Russians and the Chinese. And what Mara is saying is absolutely right about the capability. So I still believe when there's a will, there's a way, but that way is also very important, and the issue of capability. So this decision to go back is very serious. I mean, they have integrated them, at least the British, in their national security strategy. If you read the 2015 document, the Gulf is a critical component of their Middle East conversation. But that doesn't mean that this type of presence, even though it is permanent now, is sustainable. In many ways, it relates to the future of NATO and what contributions these two countries make to the alliance. I mean, the next summit is going to pretty much discuss that. And so looking at it 10 to 15 years from now, even though they have returned to the region, it remains an open question how sustainable the presence is, because the same economics that have bedeviled us, and exactly what Kat was saying before, it's probably even more prominent in their case.
All right, next question to Mark Kimmett.
Hi, my name is Mark Kimmett. I used to work for Mara at the DoD. Bilal, to your fundamental question about hub and spoke and multilateralizing the hub, given that the spokes would prefer to have a bilateral relationship with the United States, why would we want to dilute that relationship by multilateralizing it? Particularly since, while you see the French walking into the offices in Bahrain, when I'm walking into those same offices around the region, I bounce into the Russians who are trying to set up a bilateral relationship and the Chinese who are trying to set up a bilateral relationship.
Right. So absolutely right. Good point, Mark. So no secret that there's a strong preference on the part of our partners to work bilaterally. They will always tell you, whether it's in private, and actually nowadays it's in public, that we're all about multilateralism, but please not at the expense of our bilateral relations, which we have worked very hard to develop. The answer to your question, frankly, is very simple, because it is in our interest. It's that simple. As much as we are sensitive to the preferences of our partners, we have a strategic interest moving forward to encourage in a very careful and in a very gradual way this process of multilateralism, because I go back to the observation that I made and the prediction moving forward. Our current approach is simply unsustainable. And so they have to see the merits of this type of multilateralism, because it is in our interest to do so. Now, whether or not we're effective at promoting that, that's an entirely different proposition.
I would just add the operational example of the most obvious one, of course, is missile defense. And having traveled out there, yes, they're quite resistant to it, but the reality of the operational requirement is you can't operate in a hub and spoke manner entirely on the information sharing side. And they're so resistant, it varies by country, but overall, to sharing that data, that you have to point out to them that will fail. That if there is an Iranian missile attack and you're counting on a missile defense system in that small an area to operate, you have to be ready to cooperate with one another, not just with the United States. So it also has operational reality for them. And I'm completely with Bilal about, it's not either or, and but I think for the U.S. to continue to point out the problematic nature of the unwillingness to approach things collectively, I think that's a very important part of the message that we have to send.
I think they would be very sympathetic to that, quite frankly, under one condition, which I mentioned to you earlier, Mark, which is that it's all under U.S. leadership. Fine with the French and the British, as long as we are the ones who are organizing this and are leading this effort.
Next question. Yes, ma'am. One sec, there you go.
Hi, I'm Emily Packer from State Department. I have a question related to what Bilal said earlier, and also going back to our first question about Bilal had said in some cases the French and the British might be useful because they know more about the region or different things than we do. And he also related this to reform generally in the Gulf. I don't know whether that's in terms of military positioning or political reform or exactly what you were referring to. But I was just hoping Bilal could elaborate a bit more on what he meant by that.
Well, just very broadly speaking, these are two countries that have had extensive experiences in the region, that have played an active role in actually building many of the institutions that you see today in the Gulf. And so, I started with the proposition that they understand the societies way better than we do. And so if they're the ones who have had extensive relations with the political families in many ways in the region, then they have a keener understanding of what the limitations of reform are and how can we best encourage them to take the necessary steps to move forward. Now, once again, the huge caveat about the colonial past, right, and the legacy of that. So in many ways, if you talk to any member of the opposition from any country in the Gulf, not exactly the most receptive to increased French and British involvement in their politics. In many ways, they see them as, helping the oppressors and the royal families, right? But I think it's a much more complicated situation than that, frankly. And no country in the region, extra-regional, whether it's us, the French or British, do not have an interest in stability in that part of the world. And we all understand the critical importance of reform in that stability equation. It's just that we're going to continue to struggle no matter what, who is involved in that part of the world, how we actually move forward that process, because what's in the interest of the royal families sometimes is not in the interest of the United States and the French and the British. So I think if we can expand the dialogue that we've been having, the United States and the Gulf partners, and include the French and the British, it's far preferable than us just having it with them. That's basically the bottom line of it.
So Mara, I know you want to jump in. Let me just expand the question maybe a little bit, because when we talk, everybody has talked about burden sharing, sort of pushing more responsibility to these allies of ours. Is it really sustainable to do that with allies where we might have concerns that there's a big gulf in our values, in a sense? I mean, when you hear people talk about the Yemen conflict, for example, there's a lot of talk about the casualties. When you hear people talk about Syria, there's talk about supporting proxies who we wouldn't support and so forth. And then, of course, the president does talk about the need for reform in these places and that being a big block to cooperation. So is this something which ultimately undermines the idea of burden sharing, or can we get past it?
I think it's an idea, it complicates how we think about burden sharing. Because there are just so many levels, and Yemen is a perfect example, as you cited, as to how one thinks about this. I mean, look, for a number of years, I think when we thought about security cooperation with the Gulf, it was effectively what is the most expensive thing someone is buying? And it was seen within that paradigm. And then over the last few years, we've seen this really big shift, which is states actually taking actions. And so it's a different kind of conversation. It's helping them understand operationally what works, what doesn't work, strategically what works, what doesn't work. But absolutely, I mean, I think you're spot on. I would also just add, though, to this really good question. Bilal, you highlight the importance of talking about reform, and there's a duality here. It is the most important it has ever been to have these conversations, while simultaneously it is the hardest to ever have these conversations in a post-2011 atmosphere where it is inevitable for all of the states to look internally in a way that they just haven't had to in the same way. So I think that's just a particular challenge that exists for policymakers really around the world who are trying to engage on these issues.
Any other thoughts? More questions? Yes, sir.
Hi, Mike Elliman from the IISS. We've talked a lot about the mechanisms of security in the Gulf, and we focused on aircraft carriers, force postures, et cetera. But it's my sense that our Gulf partners, their biggest concern isn't an Iranian invasion, but it's Iranian meddling within their own countries and externally in Iraq and Syria and such. How do we address that in a way that maintains a structure that maintains our own values, but at the same time can be effective in pushing back on the Iranians and some of the more aggressive behavior they've taken within the societies of the Gulf partners?
Well, that's a great question, and I'd also wonder, for those of you who deal with other contexts, whether there's any lessons to be learned from what we're confronting in Eastern Europe, places like Ukraine and Estonia and so forth with the Russians.
Well, I'll jump on that. Variously called hybrid warfare, gray area warfare, provocation short of war. There is an increasing visibility, age-old, as old as war itself, but increasing visibility of whether it's China in the South and East China Sea, particularly South China Sea. Of course, we have Russia with Georgia, then Crimea, and political warfare, essentially, in terms of buying up political parties along its eastern front, to Iran and beyond. Those aren't the only cases. We do see increasingly that the ability, putting it positively, you can argue about this, but the ability of the United States to maintain that existential deterrent having the military superiority in the conventional realm has driven adversaries and potential adversaries to think about creative ways. You should expect an adversary to be smart. That is not a surprise. The question is, what should we be doing, which I think is the point of your question. So we definitely are seeing it happening. The manifestation in each region or with each actor is a little different. In the case of Iran, we do see the growth I think it might have been Bilal, I can't remember who made the very good point that that they don't have a strong conventional military, and they're not likely to get one soon, but they are growing everything from an incredible missile capability to, again, countermine, and of course what we have started to call the destabilizing activity, which sounds sort of like they're a misbehaving child, but there is a wealth of issue sets that go under that. Cyber activity, obviously support to terrorism, proxy forces, and elements of their own government that engage in destabilizing activities. So some of the pieces are well outside the military posture piece of it, and go to what is the integrated U.S. and then collective approach to countering those methods that are, say, for instance, cyber-related, energy-related, economic-related. Those become very important, and we've demonstrated, I think, quite effectively, for instance, the economic sanctions tool set for that, as one example. Cyber, I think, is another area where the U.S. is engaged pretty heavily. And then on the defense side, I think it goes back to, as Mar indicated earlier, a lot of it is building capacity issues. It's about our ability to help forces in the region, forces of all kinds, develop capabilities, but to do it inside a context that has a human rights element, has a sense of the actors that you are enabling, which is always a challenge from afar. and our special operations forces in particular bear a heavy responsibility in this realm.
I might just add, this has really been how the Iranians have kind of successfully conducted warfare over the last few decades. And it has, I think, been easier for a lot of folks to just think in a conventional way because that's kind of what we're naturally predisposed to do. I'd say there's a very heavy emphasis on this malign behavior, bad behavior, whatever one really calls it. For example, we're now doing joint patrols with our Gulf partners to try to stop Iranian shipments of weapons to unhelpful actors. I think per the question that we were just talking about in terms of reforms, though, to the extent that you have societies where everyone feels as though they are playing a role, it is actually going to be harder for Iran to try to do this kind of nefarious meddling. This gray zone conflict, in terms of we're seeing it in Russia, we're seeing it in the Asia Pacific, it doesn't play to our comparative advantages, and that's no doubt exactly why the Russians, the Chinese, or the Iranians want to do it. In some ways, I actually see it as a bit of a success. It shows that we are so strong conventionally that one shouldn't take us on in that way. And that's not actually an easy thing to have happen. And so it's something we shouldn't kind of just brush aside and focus only on sort of this hybrid warfare, gray zone warfare. So we're effectively trying to conceptualize, we're trying to think about how can one be most effective within it and thinking about it. And I think actually Kath and her team have done some of the smartest thinking on this challenge and how does one sort of effectively counter it. Right now, I think Asia Pacific is sort of the case study where we look and see with the Chinese trying to build sort of these fake islands and with various patrols that we're doing increasingly with others. So there's more to come, I think, on this challenge space. And just as there's more to come on it, there will be more to seeing how it gets applied to the Middle East.
Let me ask as an addendum to this and put this to you, Mike, since you've written about Iraq, and this will be our last question as well. Exhibit A, I think, for this concern often in our Gulf partners' minds is Iraq, because you hear the charge that, well, we've handed Iraq to the Iranians. As we've stepped back and tried to do more burden sharing in Iraq in the sort of post-2011 period, it seems to have meant on the ground Shiite militias doing more, the Kurdish Peshmerga doing more, and so forth. And maybe strengthening these sort of subnational forces. So what's your take on that? I mean, as we've tried to defeat ISIS in Iraq, are we sort of losing the long-term war to the Iranians by strengthening these, for example, Shiite militias?
Well, predicting about Iraq is a dangerous business, as a few of the rest of you know as well. I think that we should stay hopeful because, I was critical, putting on my sort of Russia hat a few minutes ago and criticizing our Syria policy. I think President Obama has done a pretty good job at repairing our problems in Iraq and repairing the policy mistakes that we had made earlier. And I think we're a legitimate competitor now in the sense of outside influence on Iraq's future. But having said that, of course, there are a huge number of unresolved questions, starting with who's going to stabilize Mosul if and when it falls, or if and when we collectively drive ISIS out. And that gets to all these issues. As you know, there's been a debate, should the Iraqis have a National Guard? But they can't quite make up their own mind about that. And many Shia worry that a Sunni National Guard out of the West could march on Baghdad. So there are a number of reasons why that idea hasn't really worked out too well. We talked about arming the tribes as a short-term response mechanism when ISIS was taking over territory in Anbar. That continues to be an important area of sort of sub-national diplomacy, working with the tribes. I'm not sure it's really our main focus now. We do have, as my colleague Ken Pollack has reported, coming back recently from Iraq, we're doing pretty well with helping train 6 or 8 of their better brigades. And that's going to be quite helpful in regard to the liberation of Mosul, but it's probably not going to be enough in regard to the stabilization of Mosul. Anyway, I'm sort of talking around the problem, but because I actually don't want to make a prediction about Iraq's future, but I would simply say that there are a number of positive elements that, and I haven't even talked about the Kurds, that we can try to work with, that essentially at least give us a chance in achieving what I think is the important goal. And it's not so much the zero-sum competition with Iran, although that's part of it, but it's fundamentally just having Iraq be reasonably stable. And if that goal can be achieved, and we have ceded a little bit more influence to Iran than we would have liked. You may not agree with me on this. My former colleague Michael Duran wouldn't agree with me on this, but I'm less worried about that than I am about the stability of Iraq, and that's a hard enough problem, I think. But you know, today's New York Times has a big story based on Vice President Biden's trip and other, you know, bringing back old debates: should Iraq be partitioned or, you know, confederal? And those are interesting conversations, but the bottom line is that I don't think that's really going to solve the problem in Iraq, because Baghdad is so multi-confessional, and because the Sunni areas are so close to Baghdad, people are always going to worry about who could march on whom and who could control the oil and, you know, the national resources. I tend to think the number one most important element, and I'll finish on this, is that the United States, if anything, should further reinforce our commitment to Iraq's future. I would even be willing to explore the concept of an alliance. And the alliance would have to be conditional. It's not going to be the sort of thing where Iraq gets to keep having all these, you know, internal drama kind of debates and then potentially, you know, inviting in Iranians into top leadership positions. And we're not going to provide an alliance commitment under those circumstances. But I actually think American durable presence, diplomatically, militarily, and otherwise, is the single best thing we can do to improve our odds of stabilizing Iraq and making sure Iran doesn't run it. And so I would actually encourage a debate that goes up to that particular concept of a formal alliance. It's not likely to be ratified by any future U.S. Senate anytime soon. But I still think it's worth putting that in the mix, because if nothing else, it underscores how important our commitment has been these last couple of years, and how important it was earlier when the Mark Himmetts of the world were working so hard at it. And I think, you know, we've got to keep that central reality in mind.
So what's the explicit bargain? I'm sorry, Mike. If we do talk about an alliance with Iraq, what is explicitly the bargain? What do we expect from them to do? Because in many ways it relates to, frankly, the Gulf partners. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah, I don't know if you can write it down on a piece of paper.
Sure.
You know, I think because there is going to be some Iranian influence, more than we will ever like, and there is going to be some drama in Baghdad, more than we would prefer. And so if you say no relationship with Iran and no drama, then you're sort of wasting your time.
Right.
So it's more a question of thresholds that we all understand and would recognize in retrospect, even if we couldn't specify them in advance. And so, you know, part of it is if there were ever going to be, if this idea of an alliance were going to be proposed, it would take obviously a couple of years to really make it happen, and then to have a Senate debate. And in that couple of years, Iraq's going to do a lot of things which we'll be watching. And so I guess that's the best answer I can give.
Okay.
Well, I think with the Middle East discussion, that's as close as you'll get to ending on a hopeful note. So let me thank all of you for coming. Again, thank the Scowcroft Center and the Atlantic Council, and please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you.